The Russian invasion of Ukraine is so far the most important event of the year and probably the defining event of the decade unless something crazier happens. While Russia continues today to occupy large parts of the south and east of Ukraine, it is daily losing ground and has been mostly internationally isolated. But how will this war end and how long will it last? This video will look to proposed peace treaties, a similar conflict, and international trends to suggest a few possible futures for the Russia-Ukraine war. But first, the scene needs to be set. At the root of all of this is a conflict for the future of Ukraine. Will the country be close to the West or to Russia? After it exited the collapsing Soviet Union, Ukraine was politically divided between those who wished to remain close with Russia, especially the Russian-speaking minority of the country, and those who wanted closer ties with the West. This debate, as well as government corruption, fueled the Euromaidan protests which drove the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych from power in 2014. Over the past 2 decades, ex-communist countries like Poland and Estonia joined NATO. In 2000, a new Russian president rose to power, Vladimir Putin. Putin sees the collapse of Russian influence in these bordering countries as a fundamental danger. In 2008, for example, Russia invaded and occupied parts of Georgia to cripple that country as it got closer to the West. Following Yanukovych's exit from power, Russia invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014. Soon after, Russia joined rebel forces in the Donbass region in the east. While Russia claims the majority of people in Crimea wish to join Russia, the referendum held was likely rigged. For these actions, Western countries imposed tough sanctions on Russia. Fighting continued over the next several years. On February 24, 2022, Russia fully invaded Ukraine. Rushing through Belarus to the north, Russian forces reached the Ukrainian capital of Kiev within a few days. Meanwhile, other Russian columns marched into Ukraine from the east and from the south. Some Western observers have speculated that Russia intended to claim the Ukrainian capital and put into power a pro-Russian puppet regime, a coup with an army. But Ukrainian resistance in Kiev proved to be stronger than Russia expected. For 2 months, the northern front was in a stalemate before Ukraine reclaimed its north in a counterattack. Today, Russia continues to occupy large parts of the south and the east of the country, but Ukraine is making progress on those fronts. Just recently, Russia has annexed its regions in the east and the south, just like it did Crimea, demonstrating its commitment to the war effort. As the invasion grinds through its 7th month, how can we expect it to end? Since the start of the conflict, Ukraine, Russia, and others have engaged in diplomatic peace efforts. Now, much of those deliberations are not open to the public. Nevertheless, we can get a sense of what both sides want from their public statements. For one, Russia has demanded the following terms. 1. The demilitarization of Ukraine. This means the demobilization of Ukrainian soldiers, a reduction in its military, the end of NATO support for Ukraine, and a binding commitment by Ukraine to remain neutral and to never join NATO. 2. The so-called denazification of Ukraine. While Ukraine does have some fascist militants, like the Azov Battalion, Russia's insistence that Ukraine's government is infested with Nazis just doesn't reflect reality. As Russia claims, Ukraine is perpetrating a genocide against Russian speakers in Ukraine, so Russia has demanded that Ukraine grant greater constitutional rights and autonomy to that group. 3. The recognition of secessionist regions as independent. Now, this originally included Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk, but doubtlessly now includes those regions that Russia has additionally annexed, Kherson and Zaporizhia. While President Zelensky has said Ukraine could agree not to join NATO, it has so far rejected other Russian demands. Instead, it says any peace process must follow complete Russian evacuation from Ukraine, including from territories that Russia claims. Ukraine has also called for punishment for those who have committed war crimes in Ukraine and guarantees from other countries that they would come to its aid if Russia invades again. Now, neither side is willing to make diplomatic sacrifices because both believe that they can still win the war. Ukraine, for example, is making progress and has many countries at its back. While the war has nearly exclusively been fought in Ukrainian turf, Russia's recent conscriptions seem to have resulted in a domestic backlash. Russia, meanwhile, maintains military dominance and believes that its annexation of new territories will strengthen domestic support for the war. With neither side willing to make sacrifices, it seems that a diplomatic solution to the conflict is far off. We can expect the progression of the war to influence whose demands are met and whose demands are dropped. International support for Ukraine has also been a key factor so far, giving Ukraine the breathing room to reject Russian demands. So far, the West has continued to send a steady flow of weapons and other military aid to Ukraine. The United States, for example, has sent more than $16 billion in aid. This includes hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition, tens of thousands of helmets, thousands of guns and missiles, hundreds of drones, and dozens of artillery pieces. Meanwhile, plenty of other countries have sent billions in aid too, including dozens upon dozens of tanks. NATO countries have also made plans to give fighter jets to Ukraine. This aid has been key to Ukraine's continued progress reversing the Russian occupation. But will it last? Well, that depends on one key factor: how well the radical right does in elections in the West. Far-right leaders like Orban in Hungary and Meloni in Italy have expressed hesitance to back Ukraine. If more are elected, like Eric Zemmour in France, Western aid to Ukraine could decrease. However, the European right has been distancing itself from Russia since the invasion. Meloni, for example, has reaffirmed her commitment to backing Ukraine. What about the United States? As of now, US President Joe Biden and congressional Democrats are more than willing to provide monetary and military aid to Ukraine, though have refrained from sending planes, tanks, and long-range weapons for fear of antagonizing Russia. While the various Ukraine aid bills have passed with the support of the majority of congressional Republicans, a good portion of the GOP, predominantly among the radical wing of the party, has voted against those bills. As Republicans are predicted to win the House in 2022, this wing of the party may be able to expand its influence and reduce aid sent to Ukraine. What about 2024? In the Senate, Democrats will have to defend their seats in several swing states across the Midwest. In the House, it seems unlikely that Democrats would gain seats. The White House is also in contention. As of now, Biden has a low approval rating, 42%, giving the two Republican frontrunners, former President Donald Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, an opening. What have those politicians said about the Russia-Ukraine war? In truth, Ron DeSantis hasn't said much about this war besides calling Russia a gas station of a country and blaming Joe Biden for the war. Trump is also a mystery, but not because he hasn't said much, but rather a lot of contradictory things. Trump has frequently complimented Russia and has previously withheld aid to Ukraine to press it to investigate Joe Biden's son. In some instances, he stated that Crimea should be part of Russia. In others, his administration rejected the annexation. While suggesting he would reduce sanctions on Russia, in actuality he increased sanctions in various instances, including sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. What can we expect from another Trump administration? Well, it seems unlikely that Trump would increase aid to Ukraine, especially when the far right of his party is opposed to it. Trump would likely press for negotiations between the US, Ukraine, and Russia, and possibly suggest a peace plan. One could imagine this plan would consist of a return to the January 2021 borders. But in truth, it seems American policy would again be unpredictable if Trump returned to power. But what about the war itself? How exactly will it progress? Now, predicting the future tends to go sour, but we can look to a similar conflict to get a sense of how wars like this one might go. Now, one could look at various conflicts over the past 30 years. However, many of these wars don't match the scale of the Russia-Ukraine war or involve a more successful initial invasion than a protracted occupation. Only one example comes to mind that matches what's happening today. In 1980, Iraq invaded Iran. Iran had just gone through its Islamic revolution, bringing to power a Shia Islamist government. Iraq at the time was ruled by Saddam Hussein, a newly ascendant dictator. Alongside wishing to legitimize his fledgling government, Hussein wished to eliminate the threat of Iran backing Shia rebels in Iraq, and also wanted to secure control of Khuzestan, an Arab-majority region in Iran. For 2 years, the war was fought in the border regions of Iran, with Iraq on the offensive. However, Iran recruited hundreds of thousands of motivated soldiers who successfully pressed Iraq back. Meanwhile, Iraqi Kurds rebelled against Saddam Hussein. Until 1988, the Iran-Iraq War was fought in Iraq. This was a bloody, protracted conflict characterized by trench warfare, chemical weapons, and terror bombings. After 8 years of fighting, the war ended with no border changes but over 300,000 dead. So, what are the similarities and differences between the Iran-Iraq War and the Russia-Ukraine War? One similarity is scope. All players involved initially had armies numbering over 100,000 at the start of the war. The battlefields are also similar in size. Comparisons between the leaders of Iran, Iraq, or Russia are apparent as well. Additionally, great powers such as the US, Britain, and France supported Iraq and sold them weapons similar to Ukraine today, though of course, Ukraine didn't invade Russia. While some of the Iran-Iraq war was fought in mountainous areas, much of it was fought in the arid lowlands of Khuzestan and southeastern Iraq. Perhaps this environment is similar to that of the flat farmlands of Ukraine. Connections can also be drawn between the hot Iraqi summer and the cold Ukrainian winter. Obviously, there are key differences. For one, Iran had nearly 3 times the population of Iraq when it invaded in 1980, giving it a large base from which to recruit more soldiers. Comparably, Russia has 100 million more people than Ukraine. However, today Ukraine has greater international support than Iran did. Both notably have armies with high morale. Besides technological variation and different political situations, there's another key factor. Russia has nuclear weapons. This is a key trump card that can be used as a deterrent against Western forces joining Ukraine and Ukraine invading Russia itself if it does turn the tide of the war like Iran did. So if the Russia-Ukraine war goes like the Iraq-Iran war, what'll happen? Well, one can expect Ukraine to continue making gains against Russia. These may be reversed or slowed, but Ukraine clearly has a higher morale and greater international support. With Russia becoming desperate, one can expect increased instances of war crimes, maybe even the widespread use of chemical weapons and terror bombings in border regions. As Ukraine becomes more muddy during Rasputitsa season, one can expect warfare to slow to a grind and the widespread return of trenches. We can already see trenches being used today. Like in the case of Iraq, we should look out for internal dissidents in Russia, perhaps in the Caucasus or even among ethnic Russians as a reaction to conscription. I predict that Ukraine will, over the course of several years, retake areas occupied by Russia, but it's likely that Ukraine won't enter Russia proper because of the threat of nuclear war. At that point, a ceasefire will return the conflict to the status quo antebellum. Afterwards, Ukraine will be close to the West, but probably not a member of the EU anytime soon due to economic conditions, or a full member of NATO because of security reasons. I don't think anybody should expect Vladimir Putin to leave office, even if he is embarrassed by the loss in Ukraine. Saddam Hussein, for example, stayed in power even after he was defeated by Iran, and again in the First Gulf War. After being defeated in Ukraine, Putin has other areas he can attack to repair his image, maybe northern Kazakhstan, which has a Russian minority, for example. Comparably, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait only 2 years after the end of his war with Iran. Here is a depiction of how the war in Ukraine might go if it matches the Iran-Iraq war. As you can see, I have depicted Russia being expelled from most areas in eastern Ukraine that they entered in 2014. However, I think geography will be a serious barrier to Ukraine regaining Crimea. The peninsula is easily defensible, besides also being inhabited mostly by those who identify with Russia. To the west, the separatist region of Transnistria, however, could possibly be eliminated in this scenario. This region has long hosted Russian soldiers and a Russian armory and could be targeted by a joint Moldovan-Ukrainian occupation. This seems to me to be the most likely outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war. Here is a depiction of how the war in Ukraine might go if Russia regains momentum in the coming years and achieves an ultimate victory. Now, I don't think Russia is likely to take Kiev. That ship has sailed. But it is possible that declining international support and growing Russian conscript numbers will allow Russia to take these areas east of the Dnipro River, as well as areas with Russian minorities close to Moscow and the north of Ukraine. As is the case for the areas that Russia currently occupies, we should expect Russia to annex any new regions as part of Russia proper. If this happens, we should expect tensions between Ukraine and Russia to remain high and continue for a long period of time, perhaps like the Korean War. Additionally, Moldova is currently at risk of a pro-Russian coup. It's well within the realm of possibility that this country switches sides to Russia if that happens. And here's a depiction of how the war in Ukraine might go in the most realistic worst-case scenario. In this case, tensions between Russia and the West continue to escalate. Now, it's not completely outlandish for Russia, desperate to ward off Ukrainian advances, to resort to using tactical nuclear weapons on the front lines against Ukrainian forces in an attempt to force Ukraine to surrender and back off. If this were to happen, China and India would probably diplomatically side with the West, and the West would then commit greater resources to the fight. Ukraine would likely thereafter make significant gains, escalating the threat of a broader, larger nuclear war. Most probably, an armistice would be agreed to before Europe gets blown off the map, but in this scenario, who knows? So these are the three scenarios in order from most likely to least likely that I could see happening in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Predictions of the future, of course, tend to be wrong, so we'll just have to wait to see. What about you? In the comments below, feel free to share how you think the war will progress, or if I missed something. Also, don't forget to subscribe for more analysis.